Hey guys! Tonight we're going to slowly journey through the complete story of World War II, one of the most influential events in modern history. Instead of rushing from battle to battle, we'll explore how ordinary people, soldiers, leaders, and entire nations experienced 6 long years that changed the world forever. If you enjoy relaxing history like this, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel before we begin. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself drift into the past. In the late 1930s, Europe stood on the edge of another disaster. The wounds left by the First World War had never fully healed, and many countries were still struggling with economic hardship, political unrest, and growing fear about what the future might bring. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, had spent years rebuilding under Adolf Hitler, who promised to restore the nation's pride and strength. Factories worked day and night. New roads stretched across the countryside, and military production quietly expanded. Despite international agreements meant to prevent another war, across Europe many hoped peace could still be preserved. Britain and France remembered the unimaginable losses of the previous war and desperately wished to avoid another conflict. Diplomats met in elegant halls, signed agreements, and made promises they believed would keep Europe stable. Yet beneath the surface, tension continued to grow. One country after another watched Germany expand its influence without serious resistance. Austria was absorbed into the German Reich, followed by the Sudetenland, and eventually the rest of Czechoslovakia. Each step convinced Hitler that Europe was unwilling to stop him. Meanwhile, ordinary families continued living their daily lives. Farmers harvested crops, shopkeepers opened their stores each morning. Children attended school, and factory workers finished long shifts, unaware that history was quietly moving toward one of its darkest chapters. Newspapers carried worrying headlines, but many believed leaders would find a peaceful solution before it was too late. Few imagined that within months, millions of people across several continents would be drawn into a conflict unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, the waiting finally ended. German forces crossed the Polish border from several directions, supported by tanks, aircraft, and thousands of soldiers moving with remarkable speed. For many Polish families, the first sign that war had arrived was not a newspaper headline, but the distant sound of explosions echoing across the countryside. Before sunrise had fully broken, villages and cities alike were already under attack. Fighter planes roared overhead while frightened civilians searched for shelter wherever they could find it. Roads that had once carried merchants and travellers quickly filled with families pulling wagons, loaded with blankets, food, and whatever possessions they could carry. Horses, bicycles, and even simple handcarts became the only means of escape as people fled advancing armies. The German military relied on a strategy that later became famous as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Instead of slow advances that had characterized much of the First World War, armoured divisions pushed rapidly forward while aircraft struck communication lines, railways, and military positions ahead of them. The speed of these attacks shocked not only Poland but the rest of Europe as well. News spread rapidly through radio broadcasts and newspaper offices in London and Paris, political leaders realised that diplomacy had finally failed. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, officially beginning what would become the Second World War. Although declarations were made, many civilians still hoped the fighting might remain limited. Some believed negotiations could still end the conflict before it consumed the continent. Unfortunately, events would soon prove otherwise. In cities across Britain, air raid shelters were prepared. Gas masks were distributed to millions of citizens, and children were evacuated from large urban areas to safer villages. Parents watched trains disappear into the distance, carrying sons and daughters to unfamiliar homes, unsure when they would meet again. Across Europe, everyday routines quietly disappeared. Shops closed early, lights were dimmed at night. Factories changed from producing household goods to manufacturing weapons, uniforms, vehicles, and ammunition. A generation that had hoped never to witness another global conflict slowly realised that history had taken a path from which there would be no easy return. As autumn turned to winter, the conflict expanded far beyond the borders of Poland. While newspapers reported military victories and political speeches, millions of ordinary people faced a very different reality. Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves under occupation, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. Food became more difficult to obtain. Strict rules appeared almost overnight, and fear quietly settled into daily life. In occupied towns, soldiers patrolled the streets while government buildings displayed new flags and new orders. Curfews were introduced, meaning people had to remain indoors after dark. Radios were often confiscated to prevent civilians from listening to foreign broadcasts, leaving many dependent on rumours passed between neighbours in whispers. Even writing a private letter required caution, as many feared their mail could be opened and inspected. Schools continued in some places, but lessons changed dramatically. Teachers were forced to remove certain books, alter history lessons, and avoid discussions that might anger the occupying authorities. Libraries lost countless volumes. Newspapers were heavily censored, and public gatherings became increasingly rare. Across the countryside, farmers struggled to keep enough food for their own families after large portions of their harvests were requisitioned for the military. In Britain, life also changed despite the fighting taking place across the English Channel. Air raid sirens became part of everyday existence. Whenever the warning sounded, people calmly gathered their children, grabbed small bags containing essential belongings, and hurried toward underground stations or public shelters. Many spent long nights beneath the streets of London, sleeping on simple blankets while listening to distant explosions above. Volunteers served tea, comforted frightened children, and tried to maintain a sense of normal life despite the uncertainty surrounding them. Factories worked around the clock producing aircraft, tanks, trucks, uniforms, and ammunition. Women entered workplaces in unprecedented numbers, taking on demanding industrial jobs while many men served in the armed forces. Entire communities adjusted their routines to support the enormous demands of a nation preparing for a long struggle. Although the front lines remained far away for some, the war reached nearly every household through ration books, blackout curtains covering every window, missing family members, and constant concern for loved ones serving overseas. It was becoming clear that this conflict would not end in weeks or even months. Instead, the world was entering a long and exhausting chapter that would test the patience, courage, and endurance of millions of ordinary people across nearly every continent. By the spring of 1940, the war entered a new and even more dramatic phase. Germany launched a series of rapid offensives across Western Europe, demonstrating once again how quickly modern warfare had changed. Denmark surrendered within hours, while neighbouring Norway fought to resist despite overwhelming pressure. The battles there were shaped not only by soldiers on land, but also by naval forces struggling through icy northern waters. Soon afterward, German attention turned toward Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Many military planners believed these countries would slow the German advance long enough for Allied armies to prepare a strong defence. Instead, armoured divisions bypassed heavily fortified positions by moving through the dense Ardennes forest, a region many experts had considered too difficult for a large army to cross. The decision caught Allied commanders by surprise. Columns of tanks, trucks, artillery, and infantry poured through narrow roads with remarkable coordination, advancing far faster than anyone had expected. Communication quickly broke down as telephone lines were destroyed and headquarters struggled to understand the rapidly changing situation. Refugees once again filled roads leading away from the fighting. Entire families carried suitcases, blankets, treasured photographs, and small pets while searching for somewhere safe. Long lines of civilians often shared the same roads as retreating soldiers, creating scenes of confusion that stretched for miles. Some people walked for days with little food or clean water, sleeping beside fields or abandoned barns before continuing their uncertain journey the following morning. In May, the German army approached the French coast, trapping hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Belgian troops near the port of Dunkirk. What followed became one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the war. Military ships, fishing boats, ferries, pleasure craft, and privately owned vessels crossed the English Channel to evacuate stranded soldiers. Many civilian captains volunteered despite knowing they could come under attack from enemy aircraft. Over several tense days, more than 300,000 troops were successfully brought back to Britain. Although much of their heavy equipment had been abandoned, the rescue preserved experienced soldiers who would later play an important role in the years ahead. Only weeks later, Paris fell and France requested an armistice. For many around the world, the speed of Germany's victories seemed almost unbelievable. Newspapers printed maps that changed almost daily, showing more of Europe under German control. Yet across Britain, rather than surrendering, preparations intensified. New pilots trained every day. Aircraft factories increased production, and millions of civilians quietly braced themselves for whatever challenge would come next. The fall of France left Britain standing alone against a powerful enemy. Across the English Channel, German leaders believed that victory was now only a matter of time before any invasion could be attempted. However, Germany needed control of the skies. This marked the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought almost entirely by air. Throughout the summer of 1940, waves of German bombers crossed the Channel escorted by fighter aircraft, aiming to destroy British airfields, radar stations, factories and ports. Their goal was simple: weaken Britain's defences until an invasion became possible. Waiting for them were the pilots of the Royal Air Force, many of whom were barely out of their teens. Every morning they climbed into cramped fighter aircraft, knowing they might be called into combat several times before sunset. The battles unfolded high above green fields, quiet villages and busy cities, often beyond the view of those on the ground who could only hear the distant roar of engines overhead. Britain's radar network played a vital role. Tall towers along the coast detected incoming aircraft long before they reached land, giving commanders precious minutes to direct fighter squadrons toward the approaching formations. This early warning system allowed the Royal Air Force to use its limited resources efficiently, sending pilots only where they were needed most. For civilians, daily life became increasingly uncertain. Air raid sirens interrupted work, school, meals, and sleep. Families hurried into underground stations, public shelters, or reinforced basements whenever the warning sounded. Children carried small gas masks almost everywhere they went, though thankfully poison gas was never used on the battlefield as many had feared. Nights were especially difficult during the period known as the Blitz. German bombers targeted London and other major cities repeatedly, dropping thousands of bombs that ignited enormous fires visible for miles. Firefighters worked tirelessly despite collapsing buildings and damaged water mains. Volunteers rescued trapped survivors from the rubble, while doctors and nurses treated the injured under incredibly difficult conditions. Yet despite the destruction, daily life continued. Buses resumed service the following morning whenever possible. Shopkeepers reopened damaged stores, and bars helped clear broken glass from the streets before beginning another day. Many people developed remarkable resilience, refusing to allow fear to dominate their lives. The determination shown by both the pilots in the sky and the civilians below convinced Germany that defeating Britain would be far more difficult than expected. As the months passed, the planned invasion was quietly postponed, marking the first major strategic setback for Hitler since the war had begun. While Britain endured relentless bombing, Adolf Hitler was already planning an even larger campaign. His attention shifted east toward the Soviet Union, a nation vast in size and rich in resources. Although Germany and the Soviet Union had previously signed a non-aggression pact, the agreement was only temporary. Hitler believed that defeating the Soviet Union would secure Germany's future, provide valuable farmland and oil, and eliminate what he considered his greatest ideological enemy. During the months leading up to the invasion, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers quietly gathered along the eastern frontier. Tanks, trucks, horses, artillery, and enormous quantities of fuel and ammunition were moved into position under strict secrecy. Then, before sunrise on June 22, 1941, the silence was shattered. More than 3 million Axis troops crossed the border in what became known as Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. The attack stretched across an immense front extending for thousands of kilometers. Entire Soviet units were caught by surprise as aircraft bombed airfields before many pilots had even reached their cockpits. Columns of German tanks raced forward while infantry followed close behind, surrounding large groups of Soviet soldiers before they could organize an effective defense. In the opening weeks, German forces advanced at astonishing speed, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and occupying countless towns and villages. For civilians, the invasion brought unimaginable uncertainty. Families abandoned their homes with only a few belongings, hoping to stay ahead of the advancing front. Roads became crowded with refugees travelling beside military convoys, heading in the opposite direction. Elderly people, young children, and exhausted parents walked for days through dust and summer heat, unsure where safety could be found. Some villages were evacuated completely, while others were destroyed during fierce fighting. Farmers abandoned freshly planted fields. Factories dismantled valuable machinery, and entire industries began moving east by rail in an extraordinary effort to keep production alive. Thousands of locomotives carried machines, workers, and their families deep into the Soviet interior, where new factories were built with incredible speed. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers fought stubborn defensive battles despite suffering enormous losses. Every river crossing, forest, and crossroads became another opportunity to slow the German advance. Although Germany had achieved spectacular victories during the first months, the campaign was already becoming far more difficult than expected. The distances were enormous. Supply lines stretched farther every week. Roads turned into clouds of dust beneath constant traffic, and vehicles required endless maintenance. Few on either side realized they were entering a struggle that would become one of the bloodiest and most decisive chapters of the entire Second World War. As summer gradually gave way to autumn, German forces continued pushing deeper into Soviet territory, believing victory was only weeks away. Yet every kilometre east seemed to demand greater effort than the last. The vast landscape presented challenges, unlike anything the German army had previously encountered. Long supply lines stretched across endless roads, making it increasingly difficult to deliver fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts to the front. Trucks broke down from constant use. Horses became exhausted after pulling heavy wagons for hundreds of kilometres, and railway systems had to be converted because Soviet tracks used a different gauge than those in much of Europe. Engineers worked day and night repairing bridges and rebuilding damaged rail lines while combat continued nearby. Despite suffering enormous losses, the Soviet Union refused to surrender. New divisions were formed continuously, drawing soldiers from distant regions stretching all the way to Siberia. Many recruits had only limited training before being sent toward the front. Yet they fought with determination, knowing their homes and families depended on stopping the invasion. Entire factories that had been relocated beyond the Ural Mountains resumed production with astonishing speed. Workers often laboured 12 or even 16 hours each day, assembling tanks, rifles, artillery pieces, and aircraft under difficult conditions. Women, teenagers, and elderly citizens filled jobs once performed by men who were now serving in the military. As October arrived, another enemy appeared, one that cared nothing for uniforms or national borders. Heavy autumn rains transformed many unpaved roads into thick seas of mud, a season the Russians called the Rasputitsa. Vehicles that had once advanced rapidly now struggled to move at walking speed. Tanks became trapped axle deep. Supply trucks slid into ditches, and horses strained desperately to pull overloaded wagons through the sticky ground. Soldiers found themselves soaked for days, their boots covered in heavy mud that clung to every step. Progress slowed dramatically, giving Soviet defenders valuable time to strengthen positions closer to Moscow. Then the first freezing nights arrived. Thin layers of ice formed across fields and rivers' wild breath became visible in the cold morning air. Many German troops had expected the campaign to end long before winter, so warm clothing was in short supply. As temperatures continued falling, weapons required constant maintenance. Engines became difficult to start, and simple daily tasks demanded far greater effort. Even preparing a hot meal or finding dry shelter became a challenge. The invasion that had begun with astonishing speed was gradually turning into a brutal contest of endurance, where patience, logistics, and survival would prove just as important as victories on the battlefield. By November 1941, the German army stood closer to Moscow than anyone had imagined possible. Only a few months earlier, some areas, soldiers could see the distant glow of the Soviet capital against the night sky. Many believed the campaign was nearly over and that one final push would bring complete victory before the end of the year. Yet the closer they came to Moscow, the stronger Soviet resistance became. Defensive lines surrounded the city, reinforced by trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and thousands of determined soldiers. Civilians also played an important role. Men and women volunteered to dig defensive positions outside the capital despite freezing temperatures. Students, factory workers, and office employees spent long days carrying shovels instead of briefcases, building barriers designed to slow the advancing enemy. Public buildings prepared for possible evacuation. Museums carefully packed priceless works of art, and government offices developed emergency plans in case the city fell. Even so, Soviet leaders chose to remain in Moscow, hoping their presence would strengthen public morale. As winter tightened its grip, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snow covered fields, forests, and roads, transforming the landscape into an endless blanket of white. For soldiers on both sides, survival became just as important as combat. Water froze inside canteens. Machine guns required constant cleaning to prevent mechanical failures. And sleeping outdoors became extremely dangerous. Frostbite injured thousands of troops, sometimes forcing men from the front without a single bullet being fired. German units, expecting a short campaign, often lacked proper winter uniforms. Many wrapped blankets around their shoulders or layered captured clothing beneath their coats in an attempt to stay warm. Engines had to be started regularly throughout the night so they would not freeze solid before morning. Horses struggled to find food beneath deep snow, while supply vehicles faced increasing difficulty travelling across icy roads. The Soviet army, although also suffering from the severe weather, had greater experience operating in harsh winter conditions. Fresh divisions from Siberia, arrived wearing heavy white camouflage, clothing and carrying equipment designed for extreme cold. Many of these soldiers had trained in regions where winter temperatures regularly fell well below those now surrounding Moscow. Early in December, after weeks of defending the capital, the Soviet Union launched a powerful counteroffensive, supported by tanks, artillery, and fresh reserves. Soviet troops attacked exhausted German positions along a broad front. For the first time since the invasion began, German forces were pushed backward in significant numbers. The rapid advance that had shocked the world only months earlier had finally been halted, proving that the war in the East would be far longer, harder, and more costly than anyone had predicted. The failure to capture Moscow marked a turning point in the war. For the first time since, Germany had begun its series of lightning victories across Europe. The image of an unstoppable army began to fade, although German forces remained deep inside Soviet territory. It was now clear that the conflict would not end quickly. Instead, both sides prepared for another year of fighting on an enormous scale. Throughout the winter of 1941 and early 1942, soldiers endured conditions that tested human endurance as much as military skill. Snowstorms buried roads, freezing winds swept across open fields, and temperatures often dropped low enough to freeze equipment within minutes. Small tasks that seemed simple during peacetime became exhausting challenges. Lighting a fire without attracting enemy attention, melting snow for drinking water, repairing frozen machinery, or simply keeping one's hands warm required constant effort. Many soldiers later recalled that the cold itself felt like another opponent on the battlefield. Behind the front lines, factories continued operating without pause. Across the Soviet Union, entire industrial cities worked around the clock producing tanks, aircraft, rifles, artillery shells, and trucks. Workers frequently slept beside their machines for only a few hours before beginning another shift. Food was limited. Heating was often inadequate. Yet production continued because everyone understood how important those supplies were to soldiers fighting hundreds of kilometers away. In Germany, factories were equally busy, expanding military production while scientists and engineers searched for new ways to improve weapons and vehicles. Civilians across Europe experienced increasing hardship as rationing became stricter. Butter, meat, sugar, coffee, and fuel were carefully controlled. Families learned to repair old clothing instead of buying new garments. Children collected scrap metal for recycling, and gardens became valuable sources of fresh vegetables. Even small luxuries disappeared from everyday life. Yet despite these sacrifices, many people continued celebrating birthdays, attending weddings, reading books by candlelight, and sharing simple meals together whenever possible. These quiet moments of normal life offered comfort during an increasingly uncertain future. Military commanders on both sides knew that spring would eventually arrive, bringing renewed opportunities for large offensives. Maps were studied, fresh divisions organised, and enormous quantities of ammunition, fuel, and food stockpiled for the campaigns ahead. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union showed any sign of seeking peace. Instead, each believed that one decisive victory might finally change the course of the war. As the snow slowly began to melt across the Eastern Front, Millions of soldiers prepared once again to leave their winter shelters, unaware that the next great battle would unfold along the banks of a river whose name would soon become known throughout the entire world, Stalingrad. During the spring of 1942, both Germany and the Soviet Union prepared for another massive campaign. The previous winter had shown that a quick victory was no longer possible. Yet neither side was willing to give up. German commanders believed that, instead of attacking Moscow again, they should strike farther south, where valuable oil fields and important industrial centres could strengthen Germany's war effort. Oil had become one of the most precious resources of the 20th century. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, ships, and countless other machines depended on a steady supply of fuel. Without it, even the strongest army would eventually grind to a halt. Adolf Hitler approved a new offensive aimed toward the Caucasus, mountains, and the rich oil fields beyond them. Along the way stood the city of Stalingrad, stretching for many kilometers. Beside the western bank of the Volga River, although the city carried strategic importance because of its factories and transportation routes, its symbolic value was equally significant. It bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, making it a powerful political target. Capturing it would deliver a major psychological victory, while defending it became a matter of national pride for the Soviet Union. Throughout the summer, German columns once again rolled across the open steppes of southern Russia. Dust rose behind endless lines of tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery pieces, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons. At first the advance moved rapidly, and many German soldiers believed they were witnessing another successful campaign similar to those fought earlier in the war. Villages and towns fell one after another as civilians hurried to escape. Before the front arrived, some families packed everything they owned into small carts, while others carried only a few blankets and photographs, leaving behind homes they feared they would never see again. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders rushed reinforcements toward Stalingrad. Factories inside the city continued producing tanks and weapons, even as the sound of distant artillery grew louder each day. Workers often completed a vehicle and sent it directly from the assembly line to nearby defensive positions without ever placing it into storage. Across the Volga River, ferries transported fresh troops, ammunition, food, and medical supplies despite constant danger from enemy aircraft. Every crossing became a risky journey. Pilots attacked barges and boats from above, while anti-aircraft guns fired continuously in an effort to protect those desperately needed supplies. As August approached, both armies converged on the city. Few realized that the struggle about to begin would become one of the most brutal and costly battles in human history. A battle where entire streets, apartment buildings, and even individual rooms would be fought over again and again for months without mercy. On the morning of August 23rd, 1942, the people of Stalingrad experienced one of the most devastating air attacks of the entire war. Hundreds of German aircraft filled the sky, dropping thousands of bombs across the city in wave after wave. Apartment buildings collapsed into clouds of dust. Factories erupted in flames. Railway stations were shattered, and thick black smoke rose so high that it could be seen from many kilometres away. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of trams and busy marketplaces were transformed into fields of broken bricks, twisted steel, and burning timber. Thousands of civilians were killed during the bombardment, while many others searched desperately through the ruins for missing relatives. Yet the destruction created an unexpected challenge for the attacking army. Instead of open streets where tanks could move freely, the city became a maze of shattered buildings, deep craters, collapsed walls, and narrow passages. Every ruined factory, basement, stairwell, and apartment block could now be turned into a defensive position. Soviet commanders quickly ordered their troops to hold the city at all costs. Reinforcements crossed the Volga River mostly at night, since daylight crossings often came under constant attack from German aircraft and artillery. Many soldiers stepped off small boats directly into combat, receiving only brief instructions before moving toward the front lines. Fighting inside the city was unlike anything most soldiers had experienced before. Traditional battle lines almost disappeared. Enemy forces sometimes occupied different floors of the same building, separated only by damaged staircases or broken walls. Snipers hid among shattered windows. Machine gun crews established positions inside ruined factories, and engineers planted explosives beneath collapsed streets to slow advancing troops. Every room had to be searched carefully because danger could appear from any direction. A single warehouse, railway platform, or apartment block might change hands several times within a single day. The giant industrial complexes became symbols of the battle. The Red October Steel Factory, the Barracotti Gun Factory, and the Tractor Factory were reduced to twisted skeletons of concrete and steel. Yet fierce combat continued among the ruins. Workers who had once built machinery now fought beside soldiers defending the same. Workshops where they had previously earned their living. Smoke, dust, and the constant roar of artillery filled the air day and night, making it difficult to see more than a short distance ahead. As September passed, neither side could claim complete control of the city. Both armies suffered enormous casualties, yet neither was willing to retreat. Stalingrad had become far more than a military objective. It was now a brutal contest of determination, where every ruined street represented another test of endurance for the soldiers trapped within its shattered landscape. As October wore on, the battle for Stalingrad became a relentless struggle of endurance. Soldiers on both sides discovered that surviving a single day inside the city was often considered an achievement. Sleep came only in short moments between artillery bombardments, and even those brief periods were interrupted by the sound of collapsing walls or the crack of rifle fire echoing through the ruins. Food and clean water were difficult to obtain. Many troops survived on small portions of bread, canned meat, or whatever supplies could be carried across the Volga under constant enemy fire. Medical equipment was also in short supply. Field hospitals were established inside damaged buildings, cellars, and underground shelters where doctors and nurses worked without rest, treating wounded soldiers as explosions shook the walls around them. Despite overwhelming destruction, Soviet defenders continued refusing to abandon the city. Their commanders adopted a tactic of fighting as close to German positions as possible, by remaining only a few dozen meters away. They made it difficult for German aircraft and heavy artillery to attack without, risking their own troops. This brutal style of combat became known among soldiers as hugging the enemy. It forced battles to be decided with rifles, grenades, machine guns, and sometimes hand-to-hand fighting inside factories, offices, and apartment blocks. Every ruined building gained its own story. One of the most famous was a heavily damaged apartment block later, remembered as Pavlov's house. A small group of Soviet soldiers defended the structure for weeks, turning every window, staircase, and basement into a carefully prepared defensive position. German attacks came repeatedly, yet the defenders continued holding the building despite constant shelling. Their resistance became a powerful symbol throughout the Soviet Union, proving that determined defenders could slow even the strongest assaults. Meanwhile, German commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Although they controlled much of the city, complete victory remained out of reach. Every advance came at an enormous cost, and exhausted units had to be replaced continuously. Reinforcements arrived expecting a quick victory, only to discover a battlefield unlike anything they had imagined. Smoke permanently darkened the sky. Fires burned day and night, and the smell of dust, fuel, and shattered concrete filled the air. Far beyond the ruined streets, however, Soviet generals were quietly preparing something much larger. While German attention remained fixed on capturing the last pockets of resistance inside Stalingrad, fresh Soviet armies gathered on the northern and southern flanks, hidden by distance, careful planning, and strict secrecy. They waited patiently for the right moment to launch an operation that would completely change the course of the battle and, ultimately, the entire war. On the morning of November 19th, 1942, after months of careful planning, the Soviet Union launched one of the most important offensives of the entire war. Thick fog covered parts of the battlefield, as thousands of artillery guns suddenly opened fire at the same moment. The ground shook beneath an enormous barrage that stretched across the northern flank of Stalingrad. Shells crashed into enemy positions. For hours before waves of infantry and armoured units began moving forward, German commanders initially believed the attack was another local assault designed to relieve pressure inside the city. They soon realised something far larger was unfolding. Instead of striking the strongest German divisions fighting within Stalingrad itself, the Soviets targeted the Romanian armies defending the flanks. These units fought bravely but possessed fewer tanks, less artillery, and weaker anti-tank weapons than the forces around them. Under the weight of the massive Soviet assault, defensive lines began to collapse. Tanks pushed through gaps in the front while mechanized columns advanced rapidly into the open countryside behind German positions. The following day, a second Soviet offensive struck from the south. Once again, powerful artillery. Preparation was followed by fast-moving armoured formations that broke through the defending lines as both attacks continued advancing toward one another. German commanders struggled to understand the full scale of the operation. Telephone lines had been destroyed. Radio messages became confused, and reports arriving at headquarters often contradicted each other. Within only a few days, the northern and southern Soviet spearheads met near the town of Kaluk. On the Don River, their link-up completed a giant encirclement around Stalingrad. More than 200,000 German and Axis soldiers suddenly found themselves trapped inside an enormous pocket with no secure route of escape. At first, many officers believed relief forces would arrive quickly. Adolf Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to remain where it was, insisting that supplies could be delivered by air until a rescue operation broke through from the west. However, the reality proved far more difficult. Winter weather, Soviet fighter aircraft, and anti-aircraft guns severely limited the number of transport planes reaching the pocket. The trapped army required hundreds of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies every day, but only a fraction could be delivered. As December approached, rations grew smaller. Horses were slaughtered for meat, fuel became scarce, and medical facilities struggled to care for thousands of wounded soldiers. The city that Germany had hoped to capture had instead become a giant trap, and the balance of the war on the Eastern Front was beginning to shift in a dramatic and irreversible way. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the arrival of winter transformed an already desperate situation into a daily struggle for survival. Snow covered the shattered streets, while freezing winds swept through buildings that no longer had roofs, doors, or windows. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, pieces of cloth, or captured winter clothing, trying to stay warm during long nights when temperatures fell far below freezing. Fires were difficult to light because smoke could reveal a position to enemy artillery, and fuel had become far too valuable to waste. Every remaining vehicle was carefully protected, since replacing damaged trucks or tanks was now almost impossible. Food quickly became the greatest concern. Daily rations were reduced, again and again, until many soldiers received only a small piece of bread and a thin bowl of soup. Fresh meat disappeared almost completely, and horses that had once pulled wagons carrying supplies were gradually slaughtered to feed the starving troops. Drinking water often had to be obtained by melting snow, a slow process that required precious fuel. Hunger weakened even experienced soldiers, making simple tasks feel exhausting. Medical conditions deteriorated just as rapidly. Hospitals were overcrowded, medicine was scarce, and doctors worked continuously despite lacking basic supplies. Frostbite, pneumonia, and malnutrition spread alongside battlefield injuries. Many wounded men could no longer be evacuated because transport aircraft arriving from Germany carried desperately needed ammunition and food before taking only a limited number of casualties on their return flights. Every successful landing became increasingly dangerous as Soviet forces tightened their grip around the city. Outside the encirclement, German commanders organized a relief operation known as Operation Winter Storm. Powerful, armoured divisions advanced eastward through snow-covered countryside, hoping to break open a corridor to the trapped Sixth Army. For a brief moment, it seemed rescue might still be possible. The sound of distant artillery encouraged many soldiers inside Stalingrad, who believed help was finally approaching. However, fierce Soviet resistance slowed the advancing forces. Every village frozen river and defensive position became another obstacle. Despite determined efforts, the relief army could not reach the city. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler continued ordering the Sixth Army to hold its ground, insisting that surrender was unacceptable. As Christmas approached, many soldiers spent the holiday inside ruined basements or frozen trenches, far from their families. Some quietly read letters from home, while others shared the last pieces of chocolate or cigarettes they had saved for a special occasion. Yet, beneath the silence of that winter, everyone understood the harsh truth. Time was running out, supplies were nearly gone, and the fate of the trapped army was becoming more certain with each passing day. By January 1943, hope inside the encircled Sixth Army had nearly disappeared. The number of transport aircraft reaching Stalingrad continued to decline, and even successful flights delivered only a fraction of the supplies required each day. Airfields inside the pocket were constantly shelled, making every landing an extraordinary risk. Pilots flew through snowstorms, anti-aircraft fire, and Soviet fighter patrols, knowing that a single mistake could end their mission before reaching the city. Many aircraft never returned. Those that did often carried only a handful of wounded soldiers because every kilogram of cargo space had first been filled with ammunition, fuel, or food. The conditions within the ruins became almost unimaginable. Buildings that had once served as homes, schools, and offices now sheltered exhausted soldiers trying to survive another freezing night. Blankets froze stiff with moisture. Boots wore out after months of constant use, and uniforms offered little protection against the relentless cold. Hunger weakened entire units to the point where many men struggled simply to stand guard for several hours. Conversations increasingly focused on food, home, and the hope that somehow the fighting might soon end. Soviet commanders recognized that the trapped army was steadily losing its ability to resist. On January 10th, they launched Operation Ring, a carefully planned offensive designed to destroy the pocket completely. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire simultaneously, producing one of the heaviest bombardments of the Eastern Front. The explosions echoed across the frozen city as shells crashed into defensive positions that had already been weakened by weeks of starvation and constant combat. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced methodically, capturing one ruined district after another. German resistance remained determined, but shrinking supplies meant every defensive line became more difficult to hold. Ammunition was rationed carefully. Damaged weapons could rarely be repaired, and artillery batteries often fell, silent because they had fired their last available shells. Small groups of soldiers withdrew from one shattered building to another, attempting to delay the inevitable advance. As Soviet forces divided the pocket into smaller sections, communication between German units became increasingly difficult. Headquarters lost contact with frontline positions, while many commanders had only a limited understanding of what was happening a few streets away. Smoke from burning ruins mixed with blowing snow, reducing visibility and creating an eerie silence. Whenever the artillery briefly paused, the once powerful Sixth Army, which had marched confidently across Europe only months earlier, was now fighting for survival among the wreckage of Stalingrad, the final chapter of one of history's greatest battles was drawing steadily closer, and soon the world would witness an event that would permanently change the course of the Second World War. On January 31st, 1943, one of the most dramatic moments of the Second World War finally arrived. Soviet troops fighting their way through the shattered streets reached the headquarters of German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. Only a day earlier, Adolf Hitler had promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, a decision many historians believe carried an unspoken expectation. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in battle, and Hitler assumed Paulus would either continue fighting until the end or take his own life rather than be captured. Instead, surrounded by Soviet forces and faced with the complete collapse of organised resistance, Paulus chose to surrender. Yet the battle itself was not entirely over. In the northern section of the city, isolated, German units continued resisting for 2 more days despite having almost no food, little ammunition, and virtually no hope of escape. Finally, on February 2nd, 1943, the last organised resistance came to an end. After more than 5 months of relentless combat, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The cost was almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that well over 1 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, captured, or went missing during the campaign. Entire neighbourhoods had vanished beneath mountains of broken concrete and twisted steel. Factories that once produced tractors and machinery had become fields of rubble, while apartment buildings stood as empty shells scarred by thousands of shell impacts. The city itself was almost unrecognisable. For the Soviet Union, the victory became far more than a military success. It proved that the German army could not only be stopped but decisively defeated. News of the surrender spread quickly across the world, lifting morale among Allied nations and encouraging resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. In Germany, however, the defeat came as a profound shock. Families waited anxiously for letters that would never arrive, while newspapers struggled to explain the loss of an army that had once seemed unstoppable. The psychological impact reached far beyond the battlefield. Confidence that Germany would inevitably win the war began to weaken, both among military leaders and ordinary citizens. Although the fighting would continue for more than 2 years, Stalingrad marked the moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front shifted permanently to the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the Red Army would increasingly seize the momentum, launching one offensive after another that slowly pushed German forces westward. The frozen ruins beside the Volga River had witnessed one of history's greatest turning points, and the road that would eventually lead to Berlin had quietly begun. Amid the shattered streets of Stalingrad, following the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet Union wasted little time taking advantage of its new momentum. German forces that had spent months trying to seize the city were now forced into retreat. Across wide stretches of southern Russia, commanders hurried to establish new defensive lines before Soviet armies could exploit the breakthrough even further. Although Germany still possessed experienced soldiers and formidable military equipment, the confidence that had fueled its earlier campaigns had been deeply shaken. Across the Eastern Front, the balance of power was beginning to change. Soviet factories continued producing enormous numbers of tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, Endtracks. Every month, fresh divisions arrived at the front, equipped with new weapons and reinforced by soldiers determined to liberate their homeland. Railways stretching across the Soviet Union carried a constant stream of supplies toward the west, while engineers repaired bridges, roads, and damaged infrastructure almost as quickly as the front advanced. For ordinary civilians living in occupied territories, the changing battlefield brought both hope and uncertainty. Some villagers welcomed Soviet troops as liberators, while others had already suffered years of destruction that could never be fully repaired. Homes had been burned, farms abandoned, schools destroyed, and entire communities separated by war. Families searched for relatives whose fate remained unknown, often relying only on rumours or handwritten lists posted in railway stations and public buildings. Despite the hardships, many believed the terrible tide of the war had finally begun to turn. German commanders understood that another major Soviet offensive was inevitable, yet they hoped to regain the initiative before it arrived. Their attention focused on a large bulge in the front line surrounding the city of Kursk. This enormous salient extended deep into German-held territory, creating what appeared on military maps as a giant curve. Hitler approved an ambitious operation intended to eliminate this bulge by attacking simultaneously from the north and south, trapping large Soviet forces inside a massive encirclement. The offensive was given the name Operation Citadel. Unlike earlier campaigns, however, Soviet intelligence had learned much about the German preparations. Rather than launching a premature attack, Soviet commanders chose to wait behind carefully constructed defensive lines. Thousands of civilians joined soldiers in digging endless networks of trenches, anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and communication routes. Millions of landmines were buried across likely avenues of attack, while artillery positions were hidden behind forests and hills. Entire defensive belts stretched for many kilometres, creating one of the strongest fortified regions ever constructed during the war. By early July 1943, both sides had assembled extraordinary numbers of men and machines around Kursk. The world was about to witness the largest tank battle in history, a confrontation that would determine whether Germany could regain the initiative or whether the Soviet advance toward Europe would continue without interruption. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the long-awaited battle finally began. German artillery opened fire across the front, followed by waves of tanks and infantry advancing toward Soviet defensive positions. The objective was to break through from both the north and the south, surround the Soviet armies defending the Kursk salient, and destroy them before they could launch another major offensive. German commanders placed great confidence in newly introduced armoured vehicles, such as the Panther and Tiger tanks, believing their heavier armour and more powerful guns would provide a decisive advantage. Yet the Soviet defenders had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Instead of relying on a single defensive line, they had created several layers of fortifications stretching far into the rear. Every few kilometres attackers encountered fresh trenches, anti-tank ditches, hidden artillery batteries, machine gun nests, and minefields containing hundreds of thousands of explosives, engineers had transformed open farmland into a deadly obstacle course that slowed every advance. German tank crews often found themselves forced to stop while engineers cleared narrow paths through minefields, giving Soviet artillery precious time to target the stalled columns. Thick clouds of smoke and dust soon covered the battlefield as explosions echoed across the countryside from sunrise until long after sunset. The fighting became especially intense near the village of Prokhorovka. There, on July 12th, enormous numbers of armoured vehicles from both sides clashed at close range. Tanks manoeuvred across fields of wheat already torn apart by shellfire, sometimes engaging one another from only a few dozen metres away. Visibility was often reduced by dust, burning vehicles and smoke, making it difficult for commanders to understand exactly what was happening beyond the next hill. Infantry followed closely behind the armour, securing villages, protecting tanks from enemy soldiers, and fighting for every trench and tree line. Air forces also played an important role. Fighters battled overhead for control of the skies while bombers attacked supply routes, artillery positions, and concentrations of armoured vehicles. Throughout the day, mechanics worked tirelessly to repair damaged aircraft so they could return to combat only hours later. Despite determined German attacks, Soviet defences absorbed the assault without collapsing. Every kilometre gained required tremendous effort, and losses steadily mounted on both sides. Then new developments elsewhere in Europe forced Hitler to reconsider his plans. Following the Allied landings in Sicily, German attention shifted toward Italy, and valuable armoured divisions were ordered away from the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel was gradually called off before achieving its objective. The Battle of Kursk marked another decisive turning point. From that moment onward, Germany would never again launch a strategic offensive of similar scale in the East. Instead, the Red Army increasingly seized the initiative, beginning a series of advances that would continue almost without interruption toward the heart of Europe. After the failure at Kursk, German commanders increasingly found themselves reacting to Soviet offensives instead of planning their own. Throughout the late summer and autumn of 1943, the Red Army advanced across hundreds of kilometres, liberating towns and villages that had remained under German occupation for nearly 2 years. Every successful offensive pushed the front farther west, forcing German units to abandon carefully prepared positions and retreat toward new defensive lines. Bridges were destroyed behind them, railways were damaged, and roads became crowded with military vehicles moving alongside streams of exhausted civilians. Escaping the fighting? One of the greatest natural obstacles on the Eastern Front was the Dnieper River, one of Europe's largest waterways. German leaders hoped the broad river would provide a strong defensive barrier capable of stopping the Soviet advance. Orders were given to fortify the western bank with trenches, artillery positions, and bunkers. Hitler believed this defensive line, sometimes called the Eastern Wall, could stabilize the front and buy valuable time. Soviet commanders, however, understood that allowing the Germans to Strengthen their positions would only make future offensives more difficult. Instead of waiting, they launched immediate crossing operations along numerous sections of the river. Thousands of soldiers crossed using small wooden boats, rubber rafts, fishing vessels, and even improvised floating platforms built from doors, barrels, and logs. Many crossings took place at night under complete darkness, while others occurred during daylight despite heavy artillery and machine gun fire. Engineers worked continuously to construct temporary bridges, capable of supporting tanks and heavy equipment. Some bridges were destroyed almost as soon as they were completed, forcing construction crews to begin again under dangerous conditions. The struggle to establish bridgeheads became one of the largest river crossing operations of the entire war. Once a small foothold had been secured on the western bank, reinforcements poured across as quickly as possible. Artillery pieces were dragged through mud. Tanks carefully crossed floating bridges, and supply trucks followed close behind carrying food, fuel, and ammunition. German counterattacks attempted repeatedly to push the Soviets back into the river, but each assault became more difficult as additional Soviet forces arrived. Among the cities lying along the Dnieper was Kyiv, the historic capital of Ukraine. After fierce fighting, Soviet troops entered the city in early November 1943, ending more than 2 years of German occupation. For many residents, the arrival of Soviet soldiers marked the end of an incredibly painful chapter filled with hardship, fear, and loss. Although celebrations erupted in many places, everyone understood that the war was far from over. The front continued moving westward, and ahead lay Poland, the Baltic region, and eventually Germany itself, where even larger and more decisive battles still awaited. As the year 1944 approached, it became increasingly clear that Germany was now fighting a defensive war on nearly every front. The Soviet Union continued building its military strength at an extraordinary pace. New factories produced thousands of T-34 tanks, self-propelled guns, trucks, and combat aircraft every month, while railways carried an endless stream of reinforcements toward the Western Front. Soldiers who had survived years of brutal combat were now joined by fresh recruits, many inspired by the belief that the liberation of their homeland was finally within reach. Behind the front lines, engineers repaired roads, bridges, and railway tracks almost as quickly as advancing armies captured new territory. Military planners spent months preparing an enormous offensive that would strike directly against the centre of the German front. The operation was given the name Operation Bagration, honouring the famous Russian general Pyotr Bagration. Unlike many earlier offensives that focused on limited objectives, this campaign aimed to destroy an entire German army group defending Belarus. To ensure surprise, Soviet commanders carefully concealed their preparations. Tanks were hidden inside forests beneath camouflage nets. Artillery batteries were moved into position only at night, and false radio messages were transmitted to convince German intelligence that the main attack would occur somewhere else. Thousands of soldiers waited silently in trenches while ammunition, fuel, and supplies accumulated behind the lines. On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet offensive began. A massive artillery bombardment shook the ground across hundreds of kilometres. Within minutes, explosions shattered defensive positions. communication centres, and artillery batteries. Then waves of infantry supported by tanks and aircraft advanced through the smoke. German commanders quickly realised they faced an assault far larger than expected. Defensive lines that had seemed secure for months began collapsing under relentless pressure. Entire divisions found themselves surrounded as Soviet armoured units pushed rapidly through weak points before, turning to encircle enemy formations from behind. Supply routes disappeared almost overnight, leaving many German units isolated without food, ammunition, or reliable communication. Town after town fell as Soviet forces advanced with remarkable speed. Civilians emerged cautiously from shelters, uncertain whether the fighting had truly moved on or might return again within hours. For many families, liberation brought overwhelming relief, though it also revealed the devastating destruction left behind after years of occupation. Villages had been burned, farms abandoned, and countless homes reduced to ruins. Yet despite the damage, hope slowly returned as the front moved farther west. Operation Bagration would soon become one of the most successful offensives of the entire Second World War, destroying much of Germany's army group centre and opening the road toward Poland, where another decisive chapter of the conflict was about to unfold. By the end of the summer of 1944, Soviet armies had crossed into Poland, bringing the war closer to Germany than ever before. At the same time, events in Western Europe were placing enormous pressure on the German military. Following the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th, German commanders were forced to divide their remaining forces between two massive fronts: soldiers, tanks, aircraft, and supplies that were desperately needed in the East now had to be sent west to resist the advancing British, American, and Canadian armies. Germany no longer possessed the resources to respond effectively everywhere at once. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements became increasingly active, sabotaging railway lines, bridges, and communication networks to slow German reinforcements. Every damaged bridge and every delayed train made the defence of Germany more difficult. For ordinary civilians, however, the war remained far from over. Cities continued suffering air raids, food shortages grew worse, and millions of families still waited anxiously for news from loved ones serving on distant battlefields. Although victory for the Allies appeared more likely than ever before, everyone understood that the final road into Germany would be long, costly, and filled with fierce resistance from an enemy that refused to surrender. As the autumn of 1944 gave way to winter, Germany's borders were no longer distant objectives on Allied maps, they were directly ahead. The Soviet army continued advancing through Poland, liberating one town after another while forcing German forces into a steady retreat. Bridges were blown apart, railways destroyed, and villages became temporary battlefields before the front moved farther west. Every kilometre gained came at a heavy cost, but the momentum now clearly belonged to the Allies. Even so, German resistance remained fierce. Soldiers defending their homeland understood that defeat would bring the war to their own cities and families, and many units fought with remarkable determination despite shortages of fuel, ammunition, and experienced replacements. Meanwhile, the German leadership searched desperately for a way to reverse the situation. In December 1944, Germany launched one final major offensive in the west through the dense Ardennes forest, hoping to split the British and American armies and force the Western Allies into negotiating peace. The surprise attack initially achieved significant progress as armoured columns advanced through snow-covered roads and thick forests. However, determined Allied resistance, combined with improving weather that allowed Allied aircraft to return to the skies, gradually slowed the offensive. Within weeks, Germany had exhausted many of its remaining reserves without achieving its objectives. The failure of the Battle of the Bulge marked the last large-scale German offensive of the war. From that point onward, Allied armies advanced steadily from the west while Soviet forces continued pressing forward from the east. Germany was now trapped between two enormous military fronts that grew closer together with every passing week. Civilians inside German cities endured constant air raids, power shortages, and increasing food rationing. Families spent countless nights inside underground shelters listening to distant explosions while wondering what the next morning would bring. The conflict that had begun more than 5 years earlier was approaching its final and most decisive chapter. Ahead lay the crossing of Germany's borders, the race toward Berlin, and the dramatic final collapse of the Third Reich. By January 1945, the Sowieler oder Offensive, one of the fastest and most successful campaigns of the entire war. After months of preparation, thousands of artillery guns opened fire along the Vistula River, followed by massive formations of infantry, tanks and self-propelled guns. German defensive positions, already weakened by years of constant fighting, struggled to withstand the overwhelming assault. Within days, Soviet armoured units broke through the front and began advancing at extraordinary speed across Poland. Roads became crowded with retreating military convoys, horse-drawn wagons, refugees, and abandoned equipment. Entire German divisions found themselves cut off as Soviet spearheads bypassed strong points and continued driving west. The pace of the advance shocked military observers around the world. In only a few weeks, Soviet forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberating Warsaw after years of occupation and pushing toward the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. Along the way, Allied soldiers encountered scenes that revealed the full horror of Nazi rule, as concentration camps and prisoner camps were liberated. Thousands of starving survivors emerged from behind barbed wire. Many were too weak to walk without assistance after enduring years of forced labour. Starvation, disease, and unimaginable cruelty. Doctors, nurses, and aid workers rushed to provide emergency treatment, food, blankets, and medicine, though many victims were already beyond saving. The discoveries shocked even experienced soldiers who had witnessed years of brutal combat. Photographs and eyewitness accounts soon spread across the world, exposing crimes on a scale few people had imagined possible. Meanwhile, German civilians watched the front move steadily closer. Trains became overcrowded as families attempted to flee westward, carrying only a few belongings packed into suitcases or small carts. Others remained in their homes, uncertain whether leaving would be more dangerous than staying. Air raid sirens continued sounding almost every night, while damaged factories and railways struggled to keep supplies moving to the remaining German forces. By early February, Soviet troops reached the Oder River, in some places less than 70 kilometers from Berlin itself. Across the frozen landscape, soldiers could sense that the final battle of the European war was approaching. Both sides began preparing for what everyone understood would be the decisive struggle for the capital of the Third Reich. Throughout March and early April 1945, both sides prepared for the final assault on Berlin. Soviet commanders gathered an enormous concentration of soldiers, tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft along the Oder and Neisse rivers. Supplies had been stockpiled for weeks, bridges strengthened, and roads repaired to support the advance of hundreds of thousands of troops. Every commander understood that, capturing the German capital would not only end the war in Europe but also carry immense political and symbolic importance. On April 16th, the offensive finally began. Before dawn, thousands of Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously, creating one of the largest artillery bombardments in military history. The night sky flashed continuously as shells exploded across German defensive positions. Searchlights illuminated the battlefield in an attempt to help advancing infantry, while waves of tanks rolled forward behind the barrage. German defenders, though heavily outnumbered, resisted fiercely from trenches, bunkers, villages, and fortified hills overlooking the Oder River. The fighting around the Silo Heights proved especially difficult. For several days, German troops slowed the Soviet advance despite relentless attacks from land and air. Every ridge, road, and forest became a contested battlefield where casualties mounted rapidly. Eventually, the overwhelming weight of Soviet manpower and firepower forced the defenders to withdraw. Once the Silo Heights had fallen, the road to Berlin lay open. As Soviet armoured columns pushed westward, civilians poured onto the roads carrying whatever belongings they could manage. Many hoped to reach areas controlled by British or American forces, rather than remain in the path of the advancing Eastern Front. Inside Berlin itself, preparations for the city's defence accelerated. Barricades appeared across major streets. Bridges were mined with explosives, and anti-aircraft guns were lowered to fire directly at approaching tanks. Elderly men and teenage boys joined emergency defence units, receiving only basic weapons before being sent to positions throughout the capital. Buildings that had once housed offices, schools, and apartment families were transformed into strongpoints. Every intersection, railway station, and public square was prepared for battle. Yet despite these efforts, many military leaders privately recognized that Germany no longer possessed the strength to stop the advancing armies. The battle for Berlin, the final and most dramatic chapter of the European war, was about to begin. By the final days of April 1945, the Battle of Berlin had become a desperate struggle fought, street by street and building by building. Soviet soldiers advanced through districts that had already been heavily damaged by months of bombing. Rubble blocked roads, shattered tram lines crossed broken intersections, and smoke from burning buildings hung over the city day and night. Every advance required caution because German defenders had transformed ordinary apartments, schools, government offices, and subway entrances into defensive positions. Tanks moved slowly through narrow streets while infantry searched every doorway, basement and staircase before continuing forward. The sound of artillery never seemed to stop. Explosions echoed across the capital from sunrise until long after midnight, shaking buildings that had somehow survived years of war. Civilians remained trapped in underground shelters, listening anxiously as the battle drew closer each day. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Clean water was increasingly difficult to find, and electricity had failed across much of the city. Families shared whatever remained, hoping the fighting would end before starvation or shellfire reached them. Deep beneath the streets, Adolf Hitler remained inside the Vorbunker, surrounded by a shrinking group of military officers and loyal supporters. Reports arriving from the front grew worse with every passing hour. Armies that existed on maps often no longer existed in reality, and promised reinforcements never arrived. Despite overwhelming evidence that Germany could no longer continue the war, Hitler refused to accept defeat. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces fought only a short distance away, Adolf Hitler took his own life inside the bunker together with Eva Braun, whom he had married only the previous day. Their bodies were carried outside, covered with fuel, and burned according to Hitler's final instructions. Leadership of what remained of Germany passed to Admiral Karl Dönitz. But the military situation was beyond recovery. Soviet troops continued tightening their grip around the government district until organised resistance inside. Berlin gradually collapsed. On May 2, the city surrendered. Red flags were raised above important government buildings, symbolising the end of one of history's most brutal urban battles. Although fighting continued briefly in other parts of Europe, the fall of Berlin made Germany's defeat unavoidable. The war that had begun with the invasion of Poland nearly 6 years earlier was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion, and within only a few days the guns across Europe would at last begin to fall silent. On May 7, 1945, representatives of the German High Command met with Allied officers in the French city of Reims after years of destruction that had spread across Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, and the skies above countless cities. Germany agreed to an unconditional surrender. The agreement stated that all German military forces would cease fighting. The surrender officially came into effect on May 8th, a day now remembered across much of Europe as Victory in Europe Day, or V-Day. Church bells rang through towns that had survived years of occupation. Crowds gathered in public squares waving flags, and strangers embraced one another in celebration. In London, Paris, New York, and many other cities, enormous crowds filled the streets. Music returned to places that had known only the sound of air raid, sirens and explosions. Yet the celebrations were mixed with sorrow. Almost every family had lost someone. Millions of soldiers never returned home, and countless civilians had perished during bombings, massacres, famine, and persecution. Across Europe, hospitals remained full. Refugee camps overflowed with displaced families, and entire cities lay in ruins. Railway stations became gathering places where people searched. Notice boards covered with lists of survivors, hoping to find the names of missing relatives. Some reunions brought overwhelming joy after years of separation. while many others ended in heartbreaking silence. Although the fighting in Europe had ended, the Second World War itself was not yet over. Far across the Pacific Ocean, fierce battles between the United States and Japan continued on islands scattered across thousands of kilometers. Allied leaders now turned their attention toward bringing that conflict to an end as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Europe faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding. Roads, bridges, factories, schools, and homes would all need to be reconstructed. Entire economies had to recover, and millions of former soldiers would soon return to civilian life, carrying memories of experiences that would remain with them forever. The victory ended the fighting, but the scars left by 6 years of global war would shape families, nations, and the entire world for generations to come. Even after Germany surrendered, the world was not yet at peace. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, the war against Japan continued with remarkable intensity. American forces, together with their allies, had spent years advancing island by island toward the Japanese mainland. Every landing became a costly battle. Dense jungles, rocky cliffs, underground tunnels, and heavily fortified positions made each campaign incredibly difficult. Soldiers on both sides fought under exhausting conditions, often facing extreme heat, tropical diseases, and constant artillery fire. Battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated how fiercely Japan was prepared to defend its remaining territory. Military planners feared that a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in enormous casualties for both soldiers and civilians. Throughout the summer of 1945, Allied leaders debated how the war could be brought to an end as quickly as possible. At the same time, scientists working on the secret Manhattan Project had completed a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. Within moments, much of the city was devastated by an explosion of unprecedented power. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb struck Nagasaki. The destruction shocked governments across the globe and introduced a terrifying new era in human history. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria, rapidly defeating units that had once been considered among Japan's strongest. Facing overwhelming military pressure, catastrophic destruction, and the certainty that further resistance would only bring greater suffering, Japanese leaders accepted the Allied terms of surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of Japan formally signed the surrender documents. With that ceremony, the Second World War officially came to an end. After 6 years of conflict that had touched nearly every continent, the guns finally fell silent. More than 60 million people had lost their lives. Countless cities had been destroyed, and millions more would spend years rebuilding their homes and their lives. The war had ended, but its lessons, sacrifices, and consequences would continue shaping the modern world for generations to come. Although the fighting had ended, the world that emerged in late 1945 looked very different from the one that had entered the war 6 years earlier. Across Europe and Asia, entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Roads were blocked by collapsed buildings, Bridges had been destroyed, and railway networks that once connected nations lay twisted and broken. Millions of families returned home only to discover that their houses no longer existed. Some found only empty foundations where neighbourhoods had once stood, while others searched through damaged streets hoping to recover family photographs, letters, or small possessions that had survived the devastation. Refugees began one of the largest movements of people in human history. Former prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, forced labourers, and civilians displaced by years of fighting travelled across continents, trying to reunite with loved ones. Railway stations became emotional meeting, places filled with both joyful reunions and heartbreaking disappointment. Hospitals remained crowded for months, treating not only physical injuries, but also illnesses caused by starvation and years of hardship. Governments faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding economies that had been almost completely destroyed. Factories that once produced tanks and aircraft slowly returned to manufacturing tractors, trains, household appliances, and construction equipment. Farmers worked tirelessly to restore damaged fields, while engineers repaired power stations, ports, and communication systems. At the same time, world leaders recognized that another conflict on the same scale could never be allowed to happen again. In October 1945, the United Nations officially came into existence with the goal of encouraging cooperation between nations and preventing future global wars. Although disagreements between powerful countries would soon lead to the Cold War, the memory of the Second World War remained a powerful reminder of the terrible cost of hatred, dictatorship, and unchecked aggression. Museums, memorials, and cemeteries were built across many countries to honour the millions who never returned home. Even today, decades later, the story of World War II continues to be studied because its lessons extend far beyond the battlefield. It reminds us how quickly peace can disappear, how ordinary people often bear the greatest burdens during war, and how courage, sacrifice, and resilience can endure even during humanity's darkest moments. The legacy of the Second World War did not end with victory parades or the signing of surrender documents. In many ways, the decades that followed were shaped by the decisions made during those 6 extraordinary years. New international borders were drawn. Governments rose and fell, and millions of people found themselves living in countries very different from those they had known before the war. Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allied powers, while Berlin itself became a city separated between East and West across Eastern Europe. Soviet influence expanded rapidly, creating political changes that would define the next generation. At the same time, the United States emerged as one of the world's leading economic and military powers. These shifting alliances gradually developed into a long period of tension known as the Cold War, although the world's major powers avoided direct military conflict with one another. Competition spread through politics, technology, intelligence, and the race to explore space. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also changed military thinking forever. Nations now understood that future wars could threaten civilization itself, leading many leaders to seek new diplomatic solutions even during times of great disagreement. Meanwhile, countless veterans returned home carrying memories they rarely spoke about. Many resumed ordinary lives as teachers, mechanics, farmers, doctors, or shopkeepers. Yet the experiences of the battlefield remained with them for decades. Families rebuilt homes. Children grew up in peaceful neighbourhoods where ruins had once stood, and cities slowly recovered through years of determined effort. Memorial ceremonies became annual traditions, honouring those who had sacrificed everything during the conflict. Museums preserved uniforms, letters, photographs, and personal belongings so future generations could better understand what had happened. Today, historians continue studying World War, not only because of its military campaigns, but because it reveals how quickly ordinary life can change when peace is lost. It is a reminder that history is not only written by famous leaders and generals, but also by millions of ordinary men, women, and children whose courage, resilience, and determination carried them through one of humanity's darkest chapters. Their stories continue to teach us the value of peace, cooperation, and remembering the past so that such a tragedy is never repeated. As the years passed, the battlefields of Europe slowly transformed into quiet fields, forests, and cities once again filled with ordinary life. Visitors walking through places like Normandy, Stalingrad, the Ardennes, or Berlin today often find peaceful streets, green parks, and busy neighbourhoods. It can be difficult to imagine that these same locations were once covered in smoke, shattered buildings, and the constant sound of artillery. Time has a remarkable way of healing landscapes. Even if the memories carried by people remain much longer, every generation since the war has inherited the responsibility of remembering what happened. Veterans shared their stories with children and grandchildren. Historians preserved millions of documents, and filmmakers created documentaries to ensure that future generations would never forget the lessons learned. At such an enormous cost, diaries written by ordinary soldiers, nurses, factory workers, and civilians reveal that history is not only made by famous leaders but also by countless individuals whose names rarely appear in textbooks. A young mother protecting her children during an air raid, a railway worker repairing tracks beneath enemy aircraft, a medic treating wounded soldiers without sleep, or a farmer sharing the last pieces of bread with hungry refugees. All became part of the larger story of the war. Their courage often went unnoticed. Yet without people like them, survival would have been impossible. Today, every memorial, cemetery, preserved battlefield, and museum stands as a quiet reminder of those sacrifices. They encourage visitors not to celebrate war, but to appreciate peace. The Second World War remains one of history's most carefully studied events because it demonstrates both the worst and the best of humanity. It shows how hatred, fear, and unchecked ambition can bring unimaginable destruction, while courage, compassion, and resilience can help rebuild even after the darkest times. And as our journey through this remarkable chapter of history comes to a gentle close, perhaps the greatest lesson is that peace should never be taken for granted. It is built slowly through understanding, cooperation, and the willingness to learn from the past. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the complete story of World War II. I hope this peaceful retelling has helped you relax, while also offering a deeper appreciation of one of the most significant events in human history. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history. Long after the final shots were fired, the influence of the Second World War continued shaping everyday life in ways that many people rarely notice. Technologies developed during the conflict eventually found peaceful purposes. Radar improved civilian aviation. Advances in medicine helped doctors save countless lives. And new engineering techniques influenced transportation, construction, and communication around the world. Scientific research accelerated rapidly during the war, and although much of it began with military objectives, many discoveries later benefited ordinary people. The conflict also changed the role of women in many societies. During the war, millions had worked in factories, hospitals, transportation, agriculture, and government offices while men served on the front lines. When peace returned, many women continued pursuing careers outside the home, gradually transforming workplaces and expectations for future generations. Around the world, people also became more aware of the importance of international cooperation. Countries recognized that diplomacy, trade, and communication were essential if another global catastrophe was to be avoided. At the same time, historians, teachers, and survivors dedicated themselves to preserving the truth about what had happened. Museums carefully collected uniforms, handwritten letters, maps, photographs, and personal belongings so future generations could learn from real evidence rather than myths or rumours. Survivors of concentration camps, prisoners of war, resistance fighters, nurses, and civilians shared their experiences, often many years after the conflict had ended. Their testimonies added a deeply human perspective to the statistics found in history books. Behind every number was a person with dreams, fears, a family, and a life interrupted by war. That is perhaps the most important lesson this story leaves behind. History is not simply a timeline of battles and political decisions. It is the story of millions of ordinary people whose lives changed forever because of choices made by leaders and circumstances beyond their control. Remembering their experiences reminds us why peace, compassion, and understanding remain among humanity's greatest achievements. And even now, more than 80 years later, the echoes of World War II continue to influence the world we live in today, making it one of the most significant and enduring stories in all of human history. Perhaps the greatest reason the Second World War continues to fascinate historians is that it affected nearly every corner of the planet. More than 60 nations became involved in some way, and millions of people who had never travelled beyond their hometown suddenly found themselves serving in distant deserts, frozen forests, tropical islands, or crowded cities far from home. Every family experienced the conflict differently. Some waited anxiously for letters that arrived only once every few months, while others gathered around small radios each evening, hoping to hear encouraging news from the front. Children grew up recognizing the sound of air raid sirens before they learned. Many other everyday sounds. Parents learned to hide their fears, offering reassurance even when they themselves had no idea what the future would bring. Yet amid the destruction, countless acts of kindness quietly unfolded. Neighbours shared scarce food with one another. Strangers risked their own safety to rescue wounded civilians. Doctors treated patients regardless of nationality. And ordinary people displayed extraordinary courage without expecting recognition. These small moments of humanity remind us that even during history's darkest chapters, compassion never disappeared completely. Today, the battlefields have become places of remembrance where visitors walk peacefully among monuments and carefully maintained cemeteries. Rows of white headstones stretch across green fields, each one representing a life with hopes, ambitions, friendships, and loved ones left behind. They remind us that history is not merely about victories or defeats, but about real people whose lives shaped the world we now inhabit. As we quietly bring this long journey through the complete story of World War II to its true conclusion, we are left with one enduring message. Peace is never guaranteed. It must be protected through understanding, cooperation, and a willingness to learn from the mistakes of the past by remembering the sacrifices of those who lived through this extraordinary conflict. We honour not only their courage, but also the hope that future generations will never again experience a war on such an unimaginable scale. And with that final thought, allow your mind to slowly drift away, knowing that history's greatest lessons often speak most clearly in moments of quiet reflection. Sleep well, and thank you for spending this journey through history with me. Although the war had ended and the world slowly returned to peace, the memories carried by the soldiers who fought in World War II never truly disappeared. History books often describe great battles, famous generals, and important political decisions, but they rarely tell us what an ordinary soldier experienced from one sunrise to the next. So before we leave this remarkable chapter behind, let us spend a little more time with the men whose daily lives shaped the outcome of the war in ways that maps and statistics can never fully explain. Imagine waking before dawn in the middle of winter somewhere. Along the Eastern Front, there is no warm bedroom, no comfortable mattress, and no hot shower waiting to begin the day. Instead, you open your eyes. Inside, a shallow foxhole dug into frozen earth, or beneath the crumbling walls of a ruined building. Snow has drifted across your blanket during the night. Your boots are stiff with ice, and your fingers feel almost numb before you even stand up. The first task is not preparing for battle, but simply surviving. Another freezing morning. Some soldiers sleep with their boots on because removing them overnight could mean they freeze solid before morning. Others keep their rifles beneath their blankets so the metal parts will not become impossible to handle in the bitter cold. Breakfast, if it arrives at all, is often little more than a piece of dark bread, a cup of thin soup, or lukewarm coffee made from substitutes instead of real beans. Fresh food is a rare luxury. Supply trucks struggle to reach the front through mud, snow, damaged roads or enemy artillery fire. So every meal becomes something to appreciate. Between moments of combat, soldiers spend hours repairing trenches, strengthening bunkers with logs and sandbags, cleaning weapons, drying wet clothing over tiny fires, and writing short letters home whenever paper can be found. Those letters rarely describe the true horrors surrounding them. Instead, many reassure parents, wives, or children that everything is fine, hoping to spare loved ones unnecessary worry. In reality, every quiet moment carries uncertainty because no one knows when the next artillery shell will land or when another order will send them forward once again. For many soldiers, the greatest enemy was not always the opposing army but exhaustion itself. Days often blended together until it became difficult to remember the date or even the day of the week. Sleep rarely lasted more than a few hours before another guard shift, another march, or another bombardment interrupted what little rest was possible. At night, every unfamiliar sound demanded attention. A snapping branch in the forest, distant footsteps, or the faint rumble of engines could signal an approaching patrol. Many soldiers learned to sleep lightly, ready to grab their helmets and rifles within seconds. During quieter periods, small routines became incredibly important. Boots had to be cleaned whenever possible, not for appearance, but to prevent painful infections caused by constantly wet feet. Weapons required careful maintenance because dirt, mud, or ice could cause them to fail at the worst possible moment. Uniforms were patched repeatedly until almost every piece of fabric carried signs of months spent at diese Front. Personal belongings were kept to an absolute minimum. A photograph of family, a small notebook, a lucky coin, or a worn letter from home often became a soldier's most treasured possession. These simple items offered comfort during moments when everything else felt uncertain. Friendship also became one of the strongest sources of strength. Men who had met only weeks earlier often formed bonds that lasted for the rest of their lives. They shared food, protected one another during attacks, carried wounded comrades across dangerous ground, and celebrated even the smallest victories together. A hot meal, dry socks, or a successful delivery of mail could lift spirits more than anyone far from the battlefield could imagine. When letters finally arrived from home, soldiers gathered quietly to read every word, sometimes reading the same page over and over again, until the paper began to wear thin. Those few paragraphs reminded them that another life still existed beyond the trenches, a life filled with families, peaceful streets, and ordinary mornings that many feared they might never see again. Yet despite everything they endured, thousands continued performing their duties day after day, driven by loyalty to their comrades and the hope that each sunrise might bring them one step closer to the end of the war. Not every day at the front was filled with constant fighting. In fact, many soldiers spent long hours simply waiting for new orders, waiting for supplies to arrive, waiting for the weather to improve, or waiting for news from neighbouring units. Those quiet hours could sometimes feel more difficult than battle itself, because the uncertainty never disappeared. A peaceful morning could suddenly be interrupted by the whistle of incoming artillery, shells, or the distant sound of aircraft approaching overhead. During these pauses, Soldiers tried to create a sense of normal life whenever possible. Some shaved with cold water collected from rain barrels or melted snow, believing that maintaining simple routines helped preserve their dignity. Others repaired torn uniforms, cleaned cooking pots, or carved small souvenirs from scraps of wood to send home after the war. A deck of playing cards, a battered chess set, or a harmonica could provide precious moments of distraction. Music often drifted quietly through the camps during the evening, reminding everyone of home for just a few minutes before silence returned. Mail call was one of the most anticipated moments of the day, when a courier finally appeared carrying sacks filled with letters. Entire units gathered eagerly, hoping to hear their names. Some soldiers received several letters at once, while others waited weeks or even months without hearing from anyone. Those who received nothing often smiled politely, but disappointment was difficult to hide. A single handwritten page describing everyday life back home could restore hope after weeks of hardship. Many kept those letters folded carefully inside their uniforms, reading them repeatedly whenever loneliness became overwhelming. Weather continued to shape every aspect of military life. Summer brought clouds of dust, relentless heat, and swarms of insects that made sleep almost impossible. Autumn covered roads with deep mud that trapped vehicles and slowed supply convoys. Winter covered everything in snow and ice, forcing soldiers to spend hours simply trying to keep warm. Spring brought endless rain that flooded trenches and turned camps into seas of mud. No matter the season, nature constantly reminded everyone that survival depended not only on defeating the enemy, but also on enduring the world around them. Through every hardship, ordinary soldiers learned to appreciate the smallest comforts: a warm cup of soup, dry gloves, a friendly conversation, or even a few minutes of peaceful silence beneath a sky untouched by smoke. Even something as ordinary as eating became an important part of surviving the war. Meals were rarely predictable, and soldiers quickly learned never to waste food. Depending on where they were serving, breakfast might consist of a small piece of bread, canned meat, dried biscuits, or a simple bowl of soup prepared over a field stove. Fresh vegetables and fruit were uncommon near the front, especially during long campaigns, when supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Whenever a supply convoy successfully reached the unit, spirits immediately improved. Boxes filled with bread, coffee, sugar, chocolate, or canned food were welcomed almost as enthusiastically as ammunition. Soldiers often shared whatever they received, especially with friends who had been less fortunate. Some even saved small treats for birthdays or holidays, keeping them hidden inside backpacks until a special occasion arrived. Water was another constant concern. Rivers and streams could not always be trusted, so soldiers frequently boiled water before drinking it whenever time allowed. During fast-moving offensives, however, there was rarely an opportunity to stop. A single canteen might need to last for an entire day under the hot summer sun. In colder regions, men melted snow over tiny fires to refill their bottles, carefully conserving every match because supplies were limited. Personal hygiene also became surprisingly difficult. Weeks sometimes passed without the chance for a proper bath. Soldiers washed their faces using cold water from helmets or buckets, whenever possible, while shaving often took place with small mirrors hanging from trees or the side of military vehicles. Keeping clean was not simply about comfort. Dirt, insects, and poor sanitation could lead to illness that removed soldiers from duty just as effectively as enemy bullets. Medical officers regularly inspected units, encouraging men to care for their feet, change socks whenever possible, and report illnesses before they became serious. Across every army involved in the war, these small daily habits played an essential role in survival. They reminded soldiers that even in the middle of enormous battles, ordinary routines still mattered. A clean pair of socks, a hot meal, or a few minutes spent washing away the dust of the battlefield could restore both physical strength and morale, preparing them to face whatever challenges the next day might bring. Beyond food and shelter, one of the greatest comforts a soldier could receive was a letter from home. Mail travelled across oceans, mountains, forests, and active battlefields before finally reaching the front. Sometimes it arrived within a few weeks, while at other times months passed with no news at all. Every delivery created a wave of excitement throughout the camp. Soldiers gathered around the mail clerk, quietly hoping to hear their names called. A single envelope could brighten an entire week. Inside were often simple updates about everyday life: children learning to ride bicycles, gardens beginning to bloom, family birthdays, or neighbours asking when the soldier might finally return. These ordinary stories reminded men that somewhere, beyond the smoke and destruction, normal life still continued. Many soldiers carried those letters in the pockets of their uniforms until the paper became worn and the ink began to fade. During lonely evenings they would read the same words again and again, imagining familiar streets, family kitchens, and peaceful conversations around the dinner table. In return, soldiers tried to write reassuring messages back home. They rarely described the worst moments of the war. Instead, many wrote that they were healthy, that food was sufficient, and that there was nothing to worry about. Even when the reality was very different, they understood that parents, wives, husbands, and children were already carrying enough anxiety without hearing every frightening detail. Holidays were perhaps the most emotional moments of the year. Christmas, New Year's Day, birthdays, and other special occasions often passed far from home. Some units decorated small pine branches with empty shell casings or scraps of coloured paper. Army cooks did their best to prepare a slightly better meal whenever supplies allowed, and chaplains held simple services for those who wished to attend. For a few quiet hours, the sound of singing sometimes replaced the sound of artillery. Soldiers exchanged tiny handmade gifts such as carved pieces of wood, small drawings, or carefully saved pieces of chocolate. These gestures were modest, yet they carried enormous meaning, because they reminded everyone that kindness still existed even in the darkest circumstances. Of course, not every holiday was peaceful. Many soldiers spent Christmas or New Year's Eve inside trenches while snow fell. Silently around them and distant, gunfire echoed across the frozen landscape. Looking up at the same stars their families could see thousands of kilometres away, they wondered when they would finally return home. For countless men and women serving during the Second World War, hope became just as important as food, warm clothing, or ammunition. It was hope that helped them endure another long march, another freezing night, and another uncertain sunrise, believing that one day the war would end and ordinary life would begin again. when soldiers were not resting or writing letters. Much of their time was spent maintaining the equipment that kept them alive. Every rifle, machine gun, helmet, boot, backpack, and vehicle required constant attention. Dust, mud, rain, snow, and freezing temperatures could quickly damage even the strongest equipment. A rifle that was not cleaned properly might jam during an attack, while worn boots could leave a soldier unable to march long distances. Because of this, weapon maintenance became almost a daily ritual. Sitting beside a trench or inside a damaged building, soldiers carefully disassembled their rifles, wiped away dirt, applied small amounts of oil, and checked every moving part before putting everything back together again. Veteran soldiers often taught new recruits these routines, reminding them that careful preparation during quiet moments could save lives later. Vehicles demanded even greater effort. Mechanics worked tirelessly beneath trucks, tanks, and armoured cars, replacing damaged tracks, repairing engines, and fixing bullet holes whenever spare parts were available. Sometimes repairs had to be completed under enemy artillery fire, forcing crews to work as quickly as possible before moving their vehicles to safer positions. Engineers became some of the most valuable people in every army, building bridges across rivers, clearing minefields, repairing roads, and restoring damaged railways so supplies could continue reaching the front. Without their work, even the strongest fighting units would soon run out of food, ammunition, and fuel. Medical personnel also faced extraordinary challenges. Doctors, nurses, and medics often entered dangerous areas while battles were still taking place, carrying wounded soldiers away from the front before providing emergency treatment. Field hospitals were usually established inside schools, churches, farmhouses, or large tents positioned several kilometres behind the fighting. There, medical teams worked for countless hours with little sleep, performing operations, changing bandages, and comforting frightened patients. Many lives were saved not only by modern medicine, but by the courage and dedication of these healthcare workers, who frequently risked their own safety to help complete strangers. Across every front of the war, countless people served in roles that rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. Radio operators maintained communication between distant units. Cooks prepared meals whenever supplies allowed. Drivers transported ammunition through dangerous roads. And engineers removed unexploded bombs from towns and villages. Victory depended not only on those carrying rifles, but also on thousands of individuals performing these demanding tasks every single day. Together, their quiet determination kept entire armies moving forward, despite the enormous hardships surrounding them. Another group of people whose courage often went unnoticed were the military medics. Unlike ordinary soldiers, they carried not only medical equipment, but also the responsibility of saving lives under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Whenever a battle began, medics moved toward the sound of gunfire instead of away from it, crawling through mud, snow, broken buildings, or open fields. They searched for wounded men who could no longer reach safety on their own. Every rescue required both skill and extraordinary bravery, because artillery shells and rifle fire rarely stopped simply because someone had been injured. Many medics carried only a small medical bag containing bandages, morphine, disinfectant, and a few basic surgical tools. They worked quickly, stopping heavy bleeding, treating shock, and preparing wounded soldiers for evacuation before moving on to the next patient. Stretcher bearers followed close behind, carefully carrying the injured across difficult terrain toward field hospitals several kilometers behind the front. Sometimes the journey itself became just as dangerous as the battlefield. Narrow forest paths, damaged bridges, and muddy roads slowed every step, while aircraft occasionally attacked supply routes without warning. Inside field hospitals, doctors and nurses worked almost without interruption. Lamps remained lit throughout the night as new patients arrived hour after hour. Surgeons often performed several operations in a single day, pausing only briefly before another ambulance or truck appeared outside carrying more wounded. Blood supplies, medicine, clean bandages, and surgical instruments were always in high demand. Nurses comforted frightened patients, wrote letters for those unable to hold a pen, and stayed beside the beds of men far from home who simply needed someone to speak with during long nights of recovery. Not every patient could be saved, and those moments weighed heavily on everyone working inside the hospital. Yet despite the heartbreak, medical teams continued treating each new arrival with remarkable determination. Away from the hospitals, recovery units helped wounded soldiers slowly regain their strength. Some learned to walk again after severe injuries, while others faced the difficult reality that they would never return to the front. Rehabilitation required patience, encouragement, and months of careful treatment. For many veterans, the physical wounds eventually healed, but the memories remained much longer, even decades after the war had ended. Former soldiers often remembered the medic who reached them under fire, the nurse who stayed awake through the night, or the doctor whose calm hands gave them another chance at life. Their compassion became one of the quiet but unforgettable stories hidden within the vast history of the Second World War. Not every hero of the Second World War wore a uniform or carried a weapon. Behind every front line soldier stood thousands of ordinary civilians whose work made it possible for entire armies to continue fighting. Factory workers, railway engineers, farmers, mechanics, telephone operators, and shipbuilders all played essential roles in the enormous effort required to sustain a global conflict. Every tank that reached the battlefield had first been designed, assembled, tested, fueled, and transported by countless hands. Every aircraft required thousands of individual parts produced in factories that operated around the clock. Across Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and many other allied nations, production lines rarely stopped. Workers often completed 12-hour shifts before returning only a few hours later to begin again. Women became an especially important part of this effort. Millions took positions that had previously been held almost entirely by men. They welded ships, assembled aircraft engines, manufactured ammunition, repaired military vehicles, and worked long hours inside noisy factories where the smell of oil and hot metal filled the air. Many had never imagined themselves working with heavy machinery before the war. Yet they quickly mastered new skills because the situation demanded it. In the Soviet Union, some factories were moved. thousands of kilometers east to protect them from advancing German armies. Entire industrial plants were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, transported across vast distances, and rebuilt in new locations. Remarkably, many resumed production within only a few weeks. Engineers, mechanics, and factory workers often lived in simple wooden barracks while continuing their work through freezing winters and exhausting summer heat. Farmers also carried an enormous burden, even while many younger men served in the military. Fields still had to be planted and harvested. Older people, women, and even teenagers took responsibility for producing enough food to feed both civilians and millions of soldiers scattered across several continents. Every successful harvest became another contribution to the war effort. Meanwhile, railway workers kept supply lines moving despite damaged bridges, air raids, and constant pressure. Freight trains carrying food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment crossed thousands of kilometers every day. Delays of only a few hours could affect entire military operations. Looking back today, it becomes clear that victory depended on far more than battles alone. It was built through the combined efforts of millions of ordinary people who may never have stood on the front lines, but whose determination, hard work, and quiet sacrifices proved just as important in shaping the outcome of the Second World War. Alongside the soldiers and factory workers, there was another invisible battlefield that rarely appeared in photographs or newspaper. Headlines the world of intelligence and secret communications. Throughout the Second World War, thousands of men and women worked in complete secrecy, knowing that even their closest family members could never learn what they did each day. Their weapons were not rifles or tanks, but radios, coded messages, maps, and patience. Every morning, radio operators intercepted hundreds of enemy transmissions sent across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Most of these messages appeared to be meaningless groups of letters and numbers, carefully encrypted so that only the intended recipient could understand them. Behind locked doors, teams of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and analysts spent endless hours searching for patterns hidden within those coded signals. Sometimes a single decoded message revealed the movement of an enemy convoy, the location of a submarine, or the date of an upcoming military operation. Such information could save thousands of lives before a single shot had been fired. Spies also operated quietly behind enemy lines, disguised as ordinary civilians, business people, railway employees, or government clerks. They gathered valuable information while trying to avoid suspicion. A simple sketch of a bridge, the number of trains arriving at a station, or the location of a fuel depot could become extremely valuable to military planners hundreds of kilometers away. Their work demanded extraordinary courage because discovery often meant imprisonment or execution. Resistance groups across occupied Europe supported many of these operations. Ordinary citizens secretly hid escaped prisoners, delivered food to underground fighters, forged identification papers, and guided Allied airmen through forests and mountains toward safety. Messages were sometimes hidden inside everyday objects such as books, shoes, or bicycle frames. Children occasionally served as couriers, because they attracted less attention from occupying forces. Every journey carried enormous risk, yet countless volunteers accepted that danger because they believed freedom was worth protecting. Even weather observers played a surprisingly important role. Small teams stationed on remote islands, lonely coastlines, or isolated mountain regions reported wind, rain, fog, and temperature conditions several times each day. These reports helped commanders decide when aircraft could safely fly, when ships should sail, or when major operations should begin. Looking back today, it is remarkable how often history was influenced not only by massive armies, but also by quiet individuals working far from the battlefield, proving that information, patience, and determination could sometimes be just as powerful as the largest weapons ever built. Life at sea during the Second World War presented its own unique challenges, very different from those faced by soldiers on land. Sailors often spent weeks or even months without seeing dry land, living aboard crowded ships where every metre of space served a purpose. Battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, cargo vessels, and submarines became floating homes for thousands of men whose daily routines were shaped by the endless rhythm of the ocean. Long before sunrise, crews began their duties by checking engines, inspecting weapons, cleaning the decks, and preparing for another day at sea. Salt water constantly covered every surface, causing metal to rust quickly and requiring endless maintenance. Even simple tasks demanded teamwork because storms, high waves, and powerful winds could transform an ordinary day into a dangerous struggle against nature itself. Food aboard ships was carefully rationed. Fresh fruit and vegetables disappeared only days after leaving port, leaving sailors to rely on canned meat, dried foods, bread, and preserved vegetables. Drinking water was precious and closely monitored. Fresh showers were often limited, especially on smaller vessels, where every drop had to be conserved for long voyages. Sleeping quarters were equally cramped. Hammocks or narrow bunks were stacked closely together, and many sailors learned to sleep through the constant vibration of engines, the crashing of waves, and the occasional sound of alarms echoing throughout the ship. Perhaps the greatest fear came not from surface battles, but from submarines hidden beneath the sea. Merchant convoys carrying food, fuel, medicine, and military equipment crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from German U-boats. Escort ships sailed alongside them day and night, using sonar to search for enemy submarines lurking below the surface. Whenever an alarm sounded, sailors rushed to battle stations within moments. Depth charges exploded beneath the waves as crews hoped to protect the valuable cargo ships travelling beside them. Many merchant sailors faced incredible danger despite never firing a weapon themselves. Their ships carried the supplies that kept entire nations fighting, making them essential targets for enemy submarines and aircraft. Some convoys battled freezing storms while others crossed tropical waters where intense heat made every task exhausting. Yet regardless of the weather, the mission remained the same: keep supplies moving. Looking back today, it is clear that victory depended not only on battles fought across fields and cities, but also on countless voyages, across dangerous oceans, where ordinary sailors quietly risked their lives to ensure that armies far away never ran out of the food, fuel, and equipment needed to continue the fight. Far beneath the surface of the ocean, life aboard a submarine was even more demanding. Unlike large warships, submarines offered almost no personal space. Every corner served multiple purposes, and every kilogram of equipment had to be carefully planned before leaving port. Crew members lived among torpedoes, machinery, batteries, pipes, and storage compartments packed tightly together. Fresh air was limited whenever the submarine remained underwater, causing the atmosphere inside to become warm, humid, and heavy after many hours beneath the waves. The smell of diesel fuel, machine oil, seawater, and cooked food mixed together until new crew members often needed several days to become accustomed to it. Sleeping arrangements were extremely cramped. On some submarines, there were fewer bunks than sailors, forcing men to share beds in a system known as hot bunking. When one sailor finished his watch, another immediately took his place in the still warm bunk. Privacy simply did not exist. Every conversation, every movement, and every meal was shared with the rest of the crew. Silence became one of the submarine's greatest weapons. Whenever enemy ships were nearby, unnecessary talking stopped completely. Engines were operated as quietly as possible. Tools were handled carefully, and even footsteps became softer. Every sailor understood that a single loud noise might reveal the submarine's position. Perhaps the most frightening moments came when enemy destroyers detected a submarine and began dropping depth charges. Explosions echoed through the water with tremendous force, causing lights to flicker and the steel hull to tremble violently. Loose equipment rattled against metal walls, while dust drifted from pipes overhead. Crew members waited in complete silence, listening for the next explosion and hoping the pressure hull would withstand the punishment. Sometimes these attacks lasted only a few minutes, but others continued for hours, testing the nerves of everyone aboard. Despite the danger, submarine crews continued their missions because they knew how important their role was. They disrupted enemy supply lines, gathered intelligence, rescued stranded personnel, and forced opposing navies to devote enormous resources to anti-submarine warfare. Many patrols ended successfully, while others disappeared without leaving any trace behind. For the families waiting at home, weeks often passed without news, since submarines maintained strict radio silence throughout their patrols. Their service remains one of the most demanding and least understood chapters of the Second World War, carried out deep beneath the waves, where courage often meant enduring long periods of uncertainty in complete darkness. For those serving aboard aircraft carriers, every sunrise brought a carefully organised routine unlike anywhere else in the war. Flight decks quickly came alive with activity as mechanics inspected engines, refueled aircraft, checked ammunition, and carefully examined every control surface before a single plane left the deck. Pilots attended briefings where they studied maps, weather reports, and intelligence gathered from reconnaissance flights. Every mission required precise timing because dozens of aircraft had to take off and land within a limited amount of space. surrounded by nothing but open ocean. Sailors directing. Aircraft wore brightly coloured. Uniforms so pilots could recognise their responsibilities, even through the noise and confusion of a busy flight deck. As engines roared to life, the entire carrier vibrated. Beneath the tremendous power of dozens of aircraft preparing for launch. Once airborne, pilots often flew hundreds of kilometres over empty sea before reaching their targets. Navigation demanded constant concentration because there were few landmarks to guide them. Clouds, storms, and changing winds could quickly make finding the carrier again far more difficult than reaching the target itself. Returning home after a mission was often just as dangerous as combat. Pilots approached a moving flight deck that seemed remarkably small compared to the endless ocean surrounding it. Landing officers used coloured paddles and hand signals to guide each aircraft safely onto the deck, where heavy steel cables brought the planes to a sudden stop within only a few seconds. A single mistake could send an aircraft crashing into parked planes or sliding into the sea. Fire crews remained ready at all times, because fuel leaks or damaged aircraft could ignite without warning. Beyond the flight deck, hundreds of sailors worked below in engine rooms, radio centres, kitchens, workshops, and medical stations. Their efforts kept the massive ships operating, day and night regardless of weather or enemy activity. Every successful mission depended upon teamwork involving thousands of people, many of whom never left the ship during an entire deployment. Long weeks at sea created strong friendships among the crew. Meals, conversations, and shared responsibilities helped break the monotony of ocean life while reminding everyone that they depended upon one another for survival. Even during quiet evenings, lookouts remained at their posts scanning the horizon for enemy ships, submarines, or aircraft. The ocean often appeared peaceful, yet everyone understood that danger could emerge at any moment, making constant vigilance one of the most important duties aboard every wartime vessel. As the years slowly passed, many of those who had served during the Second World War returned to ordinary lives. Some became teachers, farmers, engineers, doctors, shopkeepers, or mechanics. Others quietly raised families, planted gardens, built homes, and watched their children grow up in a world they had fought so hard to protect. Yet, even though the uniforms were folded away and the battlefields gradually became peaceful once more, the memories remained. A certain song, the sound of distant thunder, or the smell of smoke could instantly bring back moments they had hoped never to relive. Many veterans spoke very little about what they had experienced. They believed that some memories were simply too difficult to explain to those who had never lived through them. Instead, they carried those stories silently for decades, sharing only small pieces with close friends or family members later in life. Today, as we walk through quiet museums, stand beside carefully preserved memorials, or read old letters written in fading ink, we are reminded that history is far more than a collection of dates and famous names. It is the story of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances, with courage, determination, and hope. Every helmet displayed behind museum glass once protected someone. Every photograph captured a real family, waiting patiently for a loved one to return home. Every medal represents sacrifice that cannot truly be measured. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, nature has slowly reclaimed many of the places where fierce battles once raged. Fields once crossed by tanks now grow wheat and wildflowers. Forests that echoed with artillery are filled once again with birdsong. Rivers continue, flowing peacefully past towns that have been rebuilt stronger than before. Time has healed many of the scars left upon the landscape. Yet the lessons of the war remain as important today as ever. They remind us that peace should never be taken for granted. That understanding is always stronger than hatred. And that even during humanity's darkest moments, kindness and compassion can still survive. Thank you for joining me on this long and peaceful journey through the complete story of World War II and the lives of the people who lived through it. I hope this gentle exploration of history has helped your mind slow down and your thoughts become a little quieter. Now, let the worries of today drift away. Settle comfortably beneath your blanket. Close your eyes and allow yourself to rest. Sleep peacefully, and whenever you're ready for another journey into the past, I'll be here to welcome you back. Good night.